Well, good morning. Good morning, Aimee. Hi. Good morning, Jen. Welcome back. It's really good to see you. Welcome back from your sabbatical. I want to welcome our care companions who are with us this morning, Joanne and Gail. Really good to be with you. Hi, Gail. Good to be with you all this morning. Jen, I understand you're filling in for Julika this morning. She wasn't feeling well. You've stepped into, yeah, thanks.
It's true. So glad to be able to do that and so glad to be back with you all. I have missed you so much and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you and hear your voice and see your face. Let me just say a brief word about our care companions this morning. Joanne and Gail are part of our trained care companion ministry team. They are trained by the ministers to accompany and be with and listen to the concerns or spiritual worries or challenges of congregants. And so we know in this time we're in, and certainly after a worship service, big things can be stirred up. And so Gail and Joanne are available after the service in a private Zoom room just to be with you and to listen to you. And thank you both for being with us this morning. Really appreciate your ministry to our congregation. So let's get started this morning. Welcome to everyone else who is joining us in this Zoom room. Welcome to those of you watching on our YouTube channel. And hello and welcome to those of you listening to this on the podcast at some later date or watching the YouTube recording at a later date. Really glad you're with us in spirit in this worship service. These are tumultuous and terrifying times when nothing is hidden. Everything is on the surface right now, the ugly and the horrific and even the hopeful parts of our country. It is all very visible right now. So welcome once again. It is good to be together. And I see many of you saying hello in the chat box and letting us know where you're joining us from. You're welcome to do that as well. That is part of our ritual as we come into this space to see where we are joining from and to say hello to one another. It is good to be together this morning, to remember that we gather in that spirit of giving and receiving and growing. We gather in that universalist spirit of love and hope. And as a faith community, we practice welcoming and affirming and protecting the light in each human heart. We practice listening deeply to where love is calling us next. And with humility, courage, and compassion, we act to create a more just world. We do all of these things as a faith community committed to racial justice, to dismantling white supremacy culture and building beloved community, where the liberation of Black and Indigenous and people of color is central, and really all of our liberation from those systems that harm and oppress us. That is what the beloved community is. In addition to our Sunday morning worship, we gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. for a 30-minute midweek worship service. You're welcome to join us this Wednesday at 7. I'll be leading that service, and I hope you'll join me for that. And if you've been with us a few times, if you've been a part of this online community or taken some classes or just are figuring out who we are as a faith community, we're offering our first step class right after the service today. It's a 45-minute overview and orientation of who we are and ways you can be involved at First Universalist, led by one of our church members. And you're welcome to join us for that, to learn more and to find your way in this faith community. I also want to let you know that our Newcomers Circles, the registration for those Newcomer Circles are still open. So if you're newish to the church and hoping to meet others who are also new to First Universalist, to come together to reflect on your spiritual journeys and to do that in community, you're invited to join a Newcomer Circle. These are 4 sessions facilitated by First Universalist members designed to help newcomers connect with one another and grow together as they journey with us at First Universalist. There are 2 Newcomer Circles coming up, one in February and one in March, and there's more information in the Get Connected section of the order of service. We'll put that link in the chat box. I also want to invite those of you who have been paying attention to really everyone is invited to a meeting this afternoon at 5 o'clock. It will be an update on our Capitol renovations, the phase 1 project, which is really completed, and kind of an update on what is coming up in phase 2, the plans and vision, with a lot of time for question and answers and input from you all as we move into the second phase of our Capitol renovations. So that's at 5 o'clock this evening on Zoom room. And finally, I want to let you know that our foundation board is accepting nominations for 2021 grants. And in the spirit of the original endowment, the foundation supports cutting-edge racial, climate, gender, and immigration justice efforts for which the grant truly makes a difference. Last year, the foundation awarded $105,000 to 11 different organizations. You can visit the foundation's page on our website. It's under the Giving tab for more information and to submit a nomination. Nominations are due January 29th. So welcome once again to all of you. If you're just joining us, welcome. Really glad you're with us. As has been our practice for nearly a year now, as we gather into this space, we take a moment to center ourselves, to slow down for a moment, and to take a couple of deep and slow and intentional breaths, aware of breathing in, aware of breathing out. And this is one of the ways we settle into this knowledge, this knowing that we are in community. We are centering together. We are arriving into a shared breath with one another. And so I invite you to join me in that practice now as we take 3 deep inhales and exhales. Let's take one more breath together. Oh, it's good to feel my body settling into this space with your bodies. Welcome once again. I invite you to join Canute and Harriet in saying the words for the lighting of our chalice.
Please join me for the words of the lighting of the chalice. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Good morning, everybody. This morning, the title of the story that I'm telling is The Castle with the 3 Windows. So there's a king and he lives in a castle that he has never been outside of. And the castle has 3 main windows through which he can see his kingdom. Now, what the king doesn't know is that these windows have been endowed with certain properties by the people who installed them. So there's a red window, and the red window looks out over a castle in the distance. And the window has the property of making things look bigger than they actually are. It magnifies things, and it also gives them a kind of a rosy tint. Consequently, the people that the king can see through this window, there's a castle in the distance, and those people appear to be really cheerful and powerful and valiant because of the window. There's also a blue window, and the blue window doesn't make anything any bigger or any smaller, and it looks out over the city. And in the distance, the king can see through this window the citizens, the good and obedient citizens, according to his ministers. And when his ministers stand beside him and look out that window, they say to him, now, these people are not as beautiful as the people in the red window who are our family members. They are the aristocracy of the kingdom. They are the most powerful people in the kingdom, and they deserve the best. Now, these people in the blue window, Your Highness, these people are our business people and our merchants. They are good citizens, but they are not as beautiful as our people that we see out of the rose red window. They're not as tall, and they don't deserve as many rights as us, because let's just face it, red is better than blue. And then there's a gray window that the king can see out of. And out of that window, he can see a factory. And surrounded by that factory, there are the homes of the people who work, the laborers of the community. But the gray window makes everything look really small and dirty. And when the king is looking out of that window, his ministers stand around him and they say, "Oh, Your Highness, look at how dirty and puny they are. They're like little ants walking around there. They're so small and dirty and dumb. They don't deserve any rights at all." So the king, he's never been outside of his castle. He takes the ministers at their word. He believes what he can see from his windows. Well, one day he's in his office, just doing what kings do, and there's a fly. And the fly is buzzing around, and it becomes really, really annoying to the king. And then the fly lands on the king's head. And the king looks and he plants and he smacks himself in the head trying to hit the fly. He misses, the fly flies off, and it lands on a royal vase. Now, this is an artifact of an ancient kingdom from which the king is descendant. It is priceless. And so the king grabs his scepter and he says, I'm going to get you, fly. And he walks over to the fly and he swings at the fly, and the fly flies off of the vase. But the king hits the vase and it shatters to pieces. And he thinks, oh no, what have I done? Which makes him even more mad. And he looks around to try and find that fly. And there, it's landed on his desk on an ink well. And so he takes his scepter and he sneaks over to it and he swats. And the fly flies away, and he hits the ink and he knocks it over all of the royal papers that he was supposed to sign that day. And it makes him even more mad. Oh, and he looks around, he sees, where is that fly? Ah, it has landed on the royal pooch. And he takes his scepter and he sneaks over to where the royal poodle is laying down in front of the fireplace. And very carefully, he swats at the fly. Of course, the fly flies up just in time, but he hits the poor royal poodle, who wakes up with a start and is so angry at the king, which makes the king even more mad. He looks around and he sees, I'm going to get you now. The fly has landed on the gray window. And so he takes his scepter, he sneaks over to the window, and he swats at the fly and shatters the window. The fly flies off into the open air, and the king stands there angry, fuming, when he realizes things don't look exactly the way he thought they would. The factory is not all tiny and dirty and disgusting, and the people don't look small and weak. They actually look really tall and valiant and courageous. He looks at them and he's like, wow, those people actually look like they have a lot of dignity, which makes him wonder about the other two windows. So he takes his scepter and he smashes the blue window, and he looks out and everything is the same size, and he wonders about that red window. So he takes his scepter, he walks over to it and he smashes it, and then he's really just knocked back off his feet when he sees that the castle in the distance that he thought was so glorious and beautiful, the people that he thought were so valiant and strong looking, were actually kind of gray. They were actually really kind of skinny and feeble. Many of them looked weak. And so all of this just made him so confused that he just had to sit down for a second. And overwhelmed, he laid his head down on his desk and he fell asleep. Well, while the king is napping, his ministers come into his office, and when they see that the 3 windows are broken, they call to the maintenance staff of the castle. They say, quick, come fix these things. And so while the king is asleep, they put the red window back up and the blue window and the gray window just as they were before. Well, the king wakes up and he looks around. He jumps up and he's like, oh my goodness, what happened? I can't believe this. But then everything is the way that it was before. And he calls his ministers and he says, I don't know how these windows got back here, because I broke these windows. And when I looked out, it was different. And the minister said, oh, no, king, you were sleeping. You were sleeping just now. I think what you just had was a terrible dream. And because the ministers had replaced the vase and massaged the pooch and put a new pot of ink on his desk and fresh new papers, and everything looked the way that it had been before, the king believed them. And so life just went on in that kingdom the way that it always had. That's the story. So this story belongs to you now. I give it to you, and you can do whatever you want with it. If later on you're still thinking about this story, maybe you might want to talk to people in your family about it. Or if you're around people who haven't heard the story, maybe you want to tell them the story. But maybe some of the things you want to think about are, who has the power in this story? Who benefits from the king thinking that the world is different than it actually is? And how would you change the ending if you could? How would you make this story turn out justly so that people are treated fairly and with dignity and everybody has what we call equity in the kingdom? So that's the story of the castle with the three windows. Next, you're going to hear Gather the Spirit. I'll be singing it and I'll be accompanied by Franco Holder.
Gather the Spirit, harvest our power. Our separate fires will kindle one flame. Witness the mystery of this hour. Our trials in this light appear all the same. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then, gather in hope, compassion and strength, gather to celebrate once again. Gather the spirit of heart and mind, seeds for the sowing are laid in store, nurtured in love and conscience refined, with body and spirit united once more. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then, gather in hope, compassion and strength, gather to celebrate once again. Gather the Spirit, growing in all, drawn by the moon and fed by the sun, winter to spring and summer to fall, the chorus of life resounding as one. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then, gather in hope, compassion and strength, gather to celebrate once again.
It is so good to be with you all. So good to be together, hearing your voice, Aimee, your music, Franco, these stories that sustain us. So it matters who and what we surround ourselves with. It matters that we gather up the spirit, that we unite our body and spirit as one. So let's take a moment to do that now in whatever way feels comfortable to you. For me, I'm putting my feet squarely on the floor. I'm going to roll my shoulders up and drop them down. I'm going to try to let my breath come easily, softening my gaze and breathing intentionally in and out with you for just a moment. And as we prepare our hearts and minds, our bodies and spirits for this time of shared prayer and meditation, let's gather in the spirit. Let's gather in the spirit of our ancestors, of all of our siblings, past and present, and into a future we can barely imagine. Let us gather in all those who imagined a world transformed into the shape of justice, of thriving, of growth, of resilience, of joy. Let us draw in the spirit of those ancestors, that community, some of whom are present with us now, some as a cloud of witnesses. Help us feel their presence around us, knowing that we are not alone now or ever, that together we share a vision of something greater than what is, that together we can be more resilient, more joyful, stronger, and more hopeful than we ever knew, that we can carry the brokenness we feel when we feel it, the pain in our lives and in the world around us. Together, when we gather in the Spirit, we can hold it all together. So today, let us lean into this community of the Spirit, and together let us pray. Let us pray and hold in our hearts all those who are living with isolation, with the impact of oppression, with addiction. Let us hold in our hearts all those who are carrying grief that is too much, it feels, to bear. For all of us who are living in fear for what our lives and our children's lives might be. For all of us who feel broken at times, hopeful at others, joyful or troubled. Together, we lift up our hearts and our hands and our spirits. We hope for hearts and hands and spirits that are able to see and say the truth, the true nature of things, to name it, and to stay centered in our hope and our intention for a world that can hold us all, that values each and every one of us, that listens to the voices of those on the margins, that welcomes in the identities and experiences of all. We pray for strength for our leaders and ourselves, for all who want to work for justice and transformation, for hearts that mend and spirits that strengthen, for a community past and present and future that dreams and works and breathes and moves with us. We are here together in church, in community, to do what the Black liberation theologian James Cone said we do in church, to come and find out where we are in realization and to the actualization of our dream. Where are we as we are trying to actualize our dream, our hopes? Where are we? Let us know it clearly, let us name it, and let us work for transformation. So here, may we know that gap between who we are and who we want to be, between who our community is and what we hope for it to be, between where our country is in this moment and has been in the past and where we hope it will be. Help us to name and mind that gap, working ever more to close it so that our ideals and our hopes and our faith might be realized. May we be a community that welcomes in the light of each other's lives and the truth of our experiences. May we lean into this community, past and present and future, that can hold us up and keep us seeing clearly. And together, may we practice what we preach, living into the larger love that holds us all. May this love enfold us as we acknowledge the pain and the worry that live with us today, and let us practice holding it together. Today, we mourn the death and celebrate the life of longtime church member Dick Ziegler. Dick's family has decided to postpone a memorial service due to the pandemic, but we'll share information about his service as we receive it. We also acknowledge the death of Karen Ziegler, Dick's wife, this past March, too. We hold their family in our care this morning, and we light 2 candles today. One for Dick Ziegler and one for Karen Ziegler, that their light might live on in us. So we take time now to invite you to share in the chat or to say out loud or to hold silently in your heart, to name your worries and fears, your griefs, your challenges, that we might hold them together. So I invite you to write them in the chat, to speak them if that works for you, and trust that we can hold it, all of us together. We hold so much individually and collectively. So even as you are sharing your worries and griefs in the chat, whenever you're ready, I invite you to take an intentional breath, to breathe in and out, acknowledging the pain that lives with many of us. And then with another intentional breath, in and out, I invite us to remember that gratitude and joy are practices too, practices that are key to our survival, to our imagination, to our transformation. And so I invite you again to share in the chat, to speak out loud, to hold silently in the sanctuary of your hearts, those things that are lifting you up, that are helping you hold on, that you are grateful for, that bring you joy. And if these intermix your sorrows and your joys, that is just as life is, isn't it? Grateful for so much, holding so much. We lean into this community of care, this community that can be with us, that can help us to know the true nature of things, this community we surround ourselves with, that can hold all of the joy and all of the pain, and that can help us dream our way into a new future. May the grip of addiction be loosened. May the weight of oppression be lightened. May grief be shared. May joy break through. And may love make every suffering bearable for us all. May it be so, and amen. And let us carry our prayer into song as we sing together Spirit of Life with Sarah Lindsay and Franco Holder.
Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea. Move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots hold me close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Franco. Jen, it's really good to have you back. Thanks for that prayer to hold, just that spacious prayer to hold so much of the sorrow and fear and worry, but to remember that there is joy and possibility and gratitude woven in as well. And Aimee, you kind of preached to us this morning. Thank you. Thank you. In a week where the president was impeached for a second time, charged with inciting a violent insurrection against the United States government, in a week when new details have emerged that some lawmakers allegedly gave tours on January 5th to insurrectionists, in a week where a dozen Capitol Police officers are under investigation for their possible support and complicity in the insurrection, and in a week where we've learned what we really already knew, and that is that many of those who were in Washington, D.C. last week were on watch lists known as violent white supremacists. During this week, and this weekend particularly, I've been thinking a lot about what Cornel West calls the love warriors. The love warriors that this country has and has known, the love warriors that come out of the bowels, as Cornel West says, that come out of the bowels of the American empire. So I've been thinking a lot about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin and James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates and the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors, and so many others, so many others, a cloud of witnesses and those alive today, these love warriors who are fighting and working and organizing to dismantle what James Baldwin calls the lie, what he called the lie, the belief at the heart of this country and the founding of this country that white-skinned people matter more than Black people and Indigenous people and other people of color. Before the United States became the United States in the 1600s, in the early colonies in this land, it wasn't always this way. This narrative had not yet taken root. In fact, it was poor, indentured white folks and Native Americans whose land was being stolen and who were being killed. And it was enslaved Africans who saw that they actually had common cause with one another. And so these groups of people began to build alliances with one another, to love and to partner with one another, to fight back, to rebel against the wealthy land-owning elite who controlled and harmed and murdered and dominated their lives. And it was in this context, hundreds of years ago, that the concept of a racial hierarchy was introduced by the people in power in order to pull poor white people into alliance with wealthy white landowners. By switching allegiance, the poor white folks received marginal benefits, slightly better living conditions than their counterparts. They essentially had a tiny bit more freedom, more possibility, more access, but not much. But that switch, that pivot to say that whiteness is best, is better, is superior, that's the wedge that was put in this fledgling coalition between poor white folks, enslaved Africans, and Indigenous people. And that essential narrative saying whiteness is best was set hundreds of years ago and began to take root hundreds of years ago in law, in practice, in culture. In the centuries since, science, the Bible, and outright lies have been used to solidify and build upon this narrative. Outright lies about the character, the emotions, the capacity, the feelings, the intellect of Black and Indigenous and people of color. These lies have been used to reinforce and strengthen this racial hierarchy, to justify exploitation and violence against Black and Indigenous and people of color. And so on this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, I keep coming back to the I Have a Dream speech that Dr. King delivered on August 28, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial on one end of the National Mall. As Julika reminded us when she shared part of this story last August in one of our worship services, on that day in 1963, Dr. King hadn't planned to talk about the dream in his speech. Though he had talked about the dream in other speeches around the country, on that day on the National Mall, addressing hundreds of thousands of people, he had planned to only use the image of a bad check, representing the United States' failure to deliver on the promise of freedom, the promises of equality, the promises of a true multiracial democracy. But during the speech, he started to improvise, as all good preachers will do. And in a moment when he paused, sort of picking up some threads and figuring out the next steps in the speech, the gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, who was behind him, cried out from behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." It was, as Clarence Jones, one of Dr. King's advisors, said, one of the world's greatest gospel singers shouting out to one of the world's greatest Baptist preachers. And then Dr. King started preaching, not just speaking, but started preaching and weaving together what we now know as this "I Have a Dream" speech, one of the most recognized speeches around the world. The essential issues he named then, almost 60 years ago, police brutality, voter suppression, gross indifference to the living conditions of Black folks and people of color, those issues are still with us today. What is heartbreaking is the ongoing gap between Dr. King's dream and the reality of who we are and where we are as a country. And in the past 4 years, who we really are has been more honestly revealed. And it is heartbreaking. In his brilliant 2015 book, Between the World and Me, author Ta-Nehisi Coates describes the people who believe they are white, those who have been conditioned into believing that whiteness is superior, that they are superior. Ta-Nehisi Coates calls them the dreamers. In this book, which is really a heartbreaking and poignant letter to his 15-year-old son, Ta-Nehisi Coates plays with the language of the American dream and lifts up the nightmare, in fact, of this dream. The dreamers, as Coates calls them, are oblivious to the power, to the current power they have and the historic power they have held over Black people and Indigenous people and people of color. He writes in striking language that the dreamers claim again and again, they claim innocence. The dreamers rely on forgetting and denying history. The dreamers create a myth of American exceptionalism and perfectionism and cannot see the violence and the pillaging and the harm that the country has done and is doing. Ta-Nehisi Coates explodes this innocence and ignorance, writing, "Our Black bodies built the Capitol and the National Mall. The first shot of the Civil War was fired in South Carolina, where our bodies constituted the majority of human bodies in the state." He goes on to say, "Here is the motive for the Civil War. It is not a secret. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery," declared Mississippi as it left the Union. After the Civil War, American reunion was built on a comfortable narrative that made enslavement into benevolence, white nights of body snatchers, and the mass slaughter of the war into a kind of sport in which one could conclude that both sides conducted their affairs with courage and honor. The lie of the Civil War is the lie of innocence, is the dream, says Coates. He goes on to say, historians conjured the dream. Hollywood fortified the dream. The dream was gilded by novels and adventure stories. When questioned, the dreamers respond, racism is over. But the dreamers forget how preferential treatment from the police, from the courts, from schools and businesses, from banks and neighborhood associations, from the United States government in the form of the GI Bill, as one example, have prioritized and privileged white-skinned people over all others. Ta-Nehisi Coates suggests that the dreamers don't know they're dreaming. And if they have a sense that they're dreaming, they don't want to wake up, because that would mean change. That would mean sharing resources and giving up power and reimagining everything that was built on violence. It would mean reimagining where their natural alliances rest, and it wouldn't be with wealthy white men. Nearly 60 years ago, Dr. King shared his dream, called the United States to account, called on the country's moral conscience, and lifted up the gap between a radically inclusive multiracial democracy and the current farce of the so-called land of the free. On January 6th of this year, on the National Mall, on the other end, across from the Lincoln Memorial, some of the dreamers, as Ta-Nehisi Coates calls them, those who believe that whiteness is superior, those who were fed by lies from the president and his enablers, those who came armed with weapons and conspiracy theories, those enraged by 8 years of a Black president, those who swept Trump into power 4 years ago, and those who were called by Trump to the National Mall. Many of them violently stormed the Capitol, seeking to interrupt and overturn a fair and free election and to kill those who opposed the Electoral College certification. This is the awful fruit of white supremacy, of the lie, of the dreamers, as Ta-Nehisi Coates calls them. One national mall, two very different dreams on each end of that national mall. The dream of Dr. King was a dream of a racially just country, a dream that went on to call for demilitarization and to include a poor people's campaign, a campaign that centered the dignity of working class people, that called for a living wage and affordable housing and the fruits of the country they were working so hard, laboring so hard in. On the other end of the mall, a week and a half ago, was the dream of the dreamers, a dream based on innocence, so-called innocence, and denial and lies. This is who we are as a country. This is who we are. So the question for us this morning might be this: how can First Universalist, how can our faith community, drawing on the spiritual resources we have as Unitarian Universalists, actually work to change and to repair this country? What is the work we can do to begin in our sphere of influence to change and heal and repair the harm that has happened and is happening in this country? How can we work? What is the work we can do to dismantle the lies of white supremacy culture and help create the beloved community? What is it? What practices? What is in our sphere of influence to do as a faith community? And so this morning, I want to share with you what I think this can look like, and to say that this is at its core deeply spiritual work. To pretend otherwise, I think, is a grave mistake. The healing work is spiritual work. And what I mean when I say it is spiritual work is that the essence of any spiritual life or spiritual practice, it begins, it rests with, it centers around the practice of paying attention, of really paying attention to the breath, which is why I'm so grateful when we begin these services and we pray, we actually just take some time to breathe, to notice what it's like to be in this body, these bodies, breathing, to notice that, to pay attention to the in-breath and the out-breath, to pay attention to the thoughts that come and go, to see, oh, I think that's a real story, and then to see it as a thought and to let it go. I love the practice of paying attention to where love is calling us next in our lives. Even when love is calling us to a hard place or a difficult place or a place we'd rather not go, but we listen and we pay attention and we discern that that is in fact where we need to go. It is a spiritual practice to pay attention to the stories and the experiences of those around you, of those different from you, of those in your community. Paying attention to beauty, to human beings and lives and stories, that is the foundation of a meaningful spiritual life. And for a moment right now, I want to speak to the Black and Indigenous and people of color in our congregation. I know that in so many ways you already do this practice on a daily basis, this practice of paying attention. Because of the white supremacy culture and structures we are in, so often for your very survival, you are forced to pay exquisite attention, to pay attention to the emotions and the responses and the reactions of white people. Because emotionally upset or riled up or scared white people are dangerous. They can act out, they can speak harmfully, they can call the police, they can inflict violence. You are forced to teach your children so often what to do if they are pulled over, to pay attention to every word from the police officer, not to move suddenly or to appear dangerous. Black and Indigenous and people of color, you already pay attention and understand white people and their emotions and their stories and their history better than white people do themselves. And I also want to say to the Black and Indigenous and people of color in this congregation that there are spiritual practices of attentiveness that you can engage in and deepen, but centering white emotional needs and white comfort is not one of them. So I want to suggest this morning to the white folks in the congregation that in order to begin to end the nightmare of white supremacy culture, we must pay attention to the stories and the feedback from the people most impacted by the violence and harm of the dominant system and structures of our country. The voices of those most impacted should be at the center of our awareness and our attention and our consciousness as a congregation. This is a practice we are building and cultivating. And we need to let go, I need to let go, we need to let go, the white folks, of some of the defensiveness we feel when we hear those voices and those stories and those experiences, when they honestly share with us, when they know there may be a cost and share anyway. And I will speak more personally now for just a moment and say that a sense of innocence, my own innocence, my own sense of I am not a racist, that can be the biggest barrier to truly hearing what I need to hear from those most impacted. Whether it's because of an impact I've had on them or an impact this institution, this church has had on them, it is often innocence that prevents me from truly hearing what needs to be heard. Let me give you an example. This is not from First Universalist, but it's within Unitarian Universalism and relevant to this conversation. Every year, ministers gather for what we call ministry days. This happens before the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. At ministry days, there is a tradition of the annual 25-50 service, which gives a platform to ministers who have served for 25 and 50 years, respectively, in Unitarian Universalism. And it invites these ministers who have served for 25 and 50 years to reflect on what they've observed and learned over the course of their ministry, how they have been shaped and changed in their ministry. Recently, colleagues of color and others asked the Ministers Association to reconsider this practice because it is most often white ministers who are able to enter and to maintain tenure in Unitarian Universalist communities and congregations. And so by default, it is almost exclusively white people who speak at the 25-50 service. So this proposal to reconsider this practice It is about finding new ways to hear the voices of ministers who serve Unitarian Universalism. It is recognizing that someone who has served for 5 years may have incredible insight, and someone who has served for 1 year, in conversation with someone who has served for 10 years, may have incredible wisdom to share. Listening to this feedback, to this proposal for change, and taking it seriously matters, because the current structure is harmful. It perpetuates a system of white supremacy culture. So when these colleagues share this feedback, it matters that it is put at the center of the conversation and really taken in, really heard, and really responded to. And even in this example, innocence can prevent folks from hearing what needs to be heard. Innocence that might look like, hey, well, we're not racist. This is how we've always done it. There are people who are about to celebrate 50 years and we can't change things up. That wouldn't be right. Instead of a posture of, thank you for this feedback, let's think together how we can make this a more just structure and system. And I want to be really clear, almost confessional this morning with you. I am not perfect at this practice of centering those voices and experiences in feedback. I am not perfect at this practice, and it is a growing edge for me. And I know I have no doubt harmed colleagues of color and harmed congregants of color by not fully hearing the feedback they have shared with me, the observations they have offered me, by not fully centering that and letting that in when they have taken that risk to do that. I'm sorry for harm I have caused. And as one of the spiritual leaders of this church, I'm committed to this practice of centering the stories and experiences of those most impacted by the dominant culture. And I want to say clearly this morning that this is our commitment as a church, to place in the center the voices and the stories and experiences of those most impacted and harmed by supremacy culture, by police violence and brutality, by racism, by poverty, by environmental racism, by ableism, by sexism, to respond, to listen, to center, and to respond and make changes based on what we're hearing. This is what love looks like in action. This is what hope looks like in action. It is an active practice of listening, of paying attention, of centering, and then making changes based on what is heard and learned and taken in. The gulf between King's dream and the nightmare still woven into the fabric of our country, it is vast. It is a vast gulf. But that does not mean that things cannot change. So I want to say again to the white folks, our attention, our commitment, and the centering we practice here in our own lives, in our own circles and communities, and in this faith community. Those practices matter more now than they ever have. So let us be about this work. Let us be about dismantling what hurts and harms and kills, and let us be about building the beloved community, where each and every person and each and every voice and each and every beautiful expression of humanity is welcomed and seen, embraced, and called in. Let us be about that work. Let us be about building beloved community. May it be so, and amen. So before, I'm just going to take a breath. That's what I'm going to do. So before we give and receive our offering, I want to share an update with all of you about our holiday giving project. We launched this back in November, and many of you made significant and sizable gifts. Some of you just offered a blessing, but I'm delighted to report to you that we have raised over $15,000 as part of our holiday giving project to give to Blue, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, to support the ministry they are doing within Unitarian Universalism to lift up, to center, to support Black lives. It is beautiful work, and I am grateful for the support of so many of you. And today, our offering will be a 50-50 split between First Universalist Church and Voices for Racial Justice. Voices for Racial Justice was founded in 1993. It is a movement organization of leaders who are organizing with others and culture workers who envision a world without racism, who honor the culture and knowledge and power and the healing of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. Voices for Racial Justice are committed to building power through collective cultural and healing strategies for racial justice across Minnesota using organizing, leadership training, community policy, and research. They are a powerful, dynamic organization, and we will share our offering with them this morning. There's a variety of ways you can give. You can use the Square Cash app, you can text to give, you can go to our website and make a gift from the website, you can mail in a check to the church. And if you are struggling financially or know people in your family or circle who are struggling financially, please know that we have an emergency fund available to help with rent, to help with medical bills, to help with food, to help with transportation, to help in any way you can imagine with the crises and struggles that are a part of our lives over the course of the years. We want to be here for you. So as we prepare to give and receive our offering this morning for Voices for Racial Justice, let's listen to Franco Holder, our pianist, as he plays Love Will Guide Us. May love indeed guide us. And may we remember, may we know in this space that the way forward, dear ones, beloveds, the way forward is not easy and not without danger and not without risk and challenge. And let us remember also that we know that a better world, a better way is possible. Remember that we are here for one another. We are here for you. We are here to hold each other in heartbreak and in celebration. We are here to help create a more just world. And so as we continue our journey into 2021, may you be blessed and may you be a blessing. May it be so. Let's listen to Aimee and Franco sing Go Now in Peace. Friends, you are invited to join us in the fellowship hour following this service, if you wish. That is in the link we put in the chat box. And now, as we extinguish this candle, this chalice, we do not extinguish the flame in our hearts. May that flame burn brightly until we are together again. As we end our service, I invite you to share in the chat box, I carry the flame. I carry the flame.